Hey, Blitzers, Muffin here. I'm going to go over the best penetration and worst penetration for Tier 5 to Tier 10 tanks just based on the standard ammunition. This is all according to Blitzstar's data. Now, you may be asking, why just go off standard ammunition? Well, there's a lot of different factors, but standard ammunition outside of HE or high explosive shells is the most standard, but it's also the cheapest outside of the HE round that can also help save you credit. So if you're playing with a tank where their standard AP round or whichever standard round they're using has the highest penetration value, that could actually help save you credits. While if you're playing a tank that has worse penetration value with their standard round, you sometimes are going to have to use the expensive round more often, causing you to drain your credits a lot more. So this is once again going over best to worst penetration values just according to the standard round, also just according to the most common cannon used for that tank in the game, because different cannons, different shell types all have different values, and this is just using gun rammer for all of them. So this does not use the calibrated shells, just for clarification. So going into Tier 5, the best penetration, now I'm just segmenting this out between light, mediums, heavy tank destroyers, just to give you a clear picture of the different types, because obviously tank destroyers would take the cake here, having the best cannons. But for light and medium, it's the Crusader and Matilda Black Prince at 130 millimeters of penetration. For a heavy tank, it's the VK30.01H at 150 millimeters of penetration. And for the tank destroyer, it's known as the Toaster, is 194 millimeters of penetration. Now, the worst for Tier 5 for penetration for light and medium is the VK16.02 Leopard at 80 millimeters of penetration. For the heavy tank, it's the T14 at 106 millimeters of penetration. And for a tank destroyer, it's the Nightmare at 104 millimeters of penetration. So kind of funny that the tank destroyer has worse penetration than the heavy tank. Just for like the worst of the tank and the worst of the heavy. Going into Tier 6, the best penetration for a light and medium tank is the Sherman Firefly and the Firefly Saunders SP with 171 millimeters of penetration. For a heavy tank, it's the ARL 44 at 212 millimeters of penetration. And for a tank destroyer, it's the SU 100Y at 196 millimeters of penetration. Now, for the worst penetration for the standard rounds for light and medium tanks was actually the Type 64 at 125 millimeters of penetration. For the heavy tank, it was the KV2 at 110 millimeters of penetration. And for the tank destroyers, it was the Jagdpanzer at 145 millimeters of penetration. The Jagdpanzer kind of caught me by surprise, but maybe balancing out that amazing DPM. Going into Tier 7, the light and medium tanks with the best penetration value, or the one, was the Panther 1 at 198 millimeters of penetration. The heavy with the best was between a few, the Tiger 1, the Tiger P, and the VK45.03 with 203 millimeters of penetration. And for the tank destroyer, the winner was the Stoura Mill at 231 millimeters of penetration. For the worst, ones that had for the penetration values at Tier 7 for light and medium was the AMX 1357 at 143 millimeters. For the heavy tank, it was actually the Smasher. The Smasher actually ranked in something worse. Wow, 140 millimeters of penetration. And for the tank destroyer, it was the Vindicator at 150 millimeters of penetration. Going into Tier 8, the tanks that had the best penetration values for light and medium tanks was between the FE301, the Centurion Mark I, the Defender Mark I, and a new tank that hasn't come out yet, but the Centurion Mark 51 RAAC at 226 millimeters of penetration. For the heavy tanks with the best penetration at Tier 8 was the T-34, the T-34 Independence, The EXP, all at 248 millimeters of penetration. And for the tank destroyer, it was the ISU 152 at 286 millimeters of penetration. Going into the worst penetration values for a light and medium, it was the T49 at 152 millimeters of penetration. And that's with the derp cannon. The heavy tank was the T32 and the Chrysler K at 198 millimeters of penetration. And for a tank destroyer, it was the RHM at 215 millimeters of penetration. So all of these tanks with the worst penetration values, you're more likely going to be using the gold rounds, or the rounds that cost more money, the premium ammunition, to get that penetration. For tier 9, going into the best penetration for light and medium tanks was the Leopard Prototype A and the Centurion Mark 7.1. Both had a penetration value of 255 millimeters. The heavy tank with the best was the Conquer at 259 millimeters. And the tank destroyers with the best was the WZ-111 GFT and the Ho-Ri Type 2 at 290 millimeters of penetration. Now, the worst for light and medium was the T92E1 at 210 millimeters of penetration. For the heavy tank, it was the Kampfpanzer 70 at 240 millimeters of penetration. And for the tank destroyer, it was the Waffenträger at 255 millimeters of penetration. And then lastly, going into tier 10, for the best penetration values of a light and medium tank, it was the FV-4 at 255 millimeters of penetration. For the heavy, it was a VK90. For the heavy, it was the VK90.01P at 275 millimeters of penetration. However, that tank actually, with its premium round, has the worst penetration for a heavy tank, using its premium ammo, so kind of balances out there. And then for the tank destroyers with the best penetration is the Ho-Ri Type 3 and the FE215B 183, or known as the Death Star, at 310 millimeters of standard penetration. And for the worst, at tier 10 for light and medium, was the Sheridan at 230 millimeters of penetration. The heavy tank that ranked the worst for pen was the Mouse at 246. And the worst for pen for tank destroyers was the Grill at 279 millimeters of penetration. So once again, wanted to use the standard rounds, most common cannons, everything equal the same, just using the gun rammer, not calibrated shells. There's a lot of factors that do change some of these things, but this is just standard rounds that are the most effective for the most affordable cost. Anyway, this is the Muffin here. You guys stay cool and keep tanking.